Okay, so today we are going over the closing a buyer's property contingency, the bump clause, and the secondary offer. So I'm going to go through each section and then individually, and then I'm going to go back through and describe how they are all tied together. So I'm trying to find out. Sorry, I'm just messing with some settings here. Bear with me, team. Okay, can you guys see my screen okay? Okay. Okay. Getting back to it then. All right, so the first one up is the closing of the buyer's property contingency. And I just pulled up the offer directly versus having, bullet points on a slide. I like for you guys to see the language as it is. So how it reads is, and let me backtrack. So this closing of the buyer's property contingency, when you would use this is if your buyer needs to use the equity in his home, their home, in order to and apply towards their next purchase. So, which is often the case, right? So we've got a lot of equity built up in our homes. We're using that equity as a down payment in order to move on to our next purchase. So in order to do that, what a lot of times what people need to do is include this closing a buyer's property contingency in our offer, and make this offer contingent upon the successful closing of their personal property, their current residence. So how it reads is, this offer is contingent upon the closing of the sale of the buyer's property located at, and then that's where you would just put in their address here. So write it right in there. No later than, and then you will identify the closing date. So a lot of times, most agents are mimicking the closing date that they're going to identify in here as the one that they have put in on the first page of the offer to purchase. So let's say we're requesting to close on this home on May 30th. We're going to say that our personal residence is going to close no later than that May 30th deadline as well. You can change that. If this would be different than the closing date of the property that the buyer is intending to write on, then it would make sense that this would be maybe a couple days beforehand, maybe a week beforehand. But obviously this would never be after the closing date that you put in on the first page of the offer to purchase. So no later than, and then you'll identify the closing date. And then in highlighted here, I've got, if closing does not occur by the deadline, this offer shall become null and void. So it's very clear that if the closing does not happen on that primary residence, the offer shall become null and void, and it's dead. This is actually rewritten from the old offer, which kind of was much more gray on what would happen if that closing of this primary residence did not happen. And now it's very black and white, which I appreciate, and I'm sure you guys do as well. So if the closing does not occur by the deadline, this offer shall become null and void unless buyer delivers to the seller on or before that closing date reasonable written verification from a financial institution or a third party in control of the buyer's funds at the time of verification, that they have sufficient funds to close. or a proof of a bridge loan financing, along with a written notice waiving this contingency. Delivery of verification or proof of bridge loan shall not extend the closing date for this offer. So let's say we're coming up on this May 30th deadline. There is no closing in sight for the 1234 North Main Street. Maybe they don't have an accepted offer yet. Maybe they had an accepted offer and it's shaky, or it has fallen apart. If that buyer delivers to the seller, evidence of this bridge loan, maybe, a proof of funds letter in some form, then we can keep this deal alive. What's very important though here is that delivery of this verification or proof of bridge loan shall not extend the closing date for this original offer. So unless the parties agree to extend the closing date on this offer, then it is staying at that May 30th. Or, excuse me, whatever is identified on page 1 of this offer. So that's really important for the buyer to know that, if you guys, I would say, if you're 2 weeks out and you don't have an accepted offer on this primary residence, that's when I would be getting in touch with the buyer's lender and saying, okay, it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to close. Get that money out and put it towards the down payment of this offer. So we need to go to plan B. And that's when I would probably start getting that evidence of the bridge loan together, making sure that the buyer has plan B in place. And that actually might be pushing it a little. Whenever I'm doing a buyer consultation, and it's the case where the buyer needs to put in a home close contingency, I'll always coach them to let them know, okay, when you're talking with your lenders, make sure that you are, asking about plan B. Can we do this another way if plan A does not work, which is closing on the primary residence? Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, it's pretty black and white as it relates to this contingency. So, okay, so next up we have the bump clause provision. So, I'm gonna go through this as a standalone, and then I'll tie it back to the home close contingency later on. So a bump clause. So, a bump clause can be enacted in an offer to purchase. And how this works is if a seller accepts a bona fide secondary offer, the seller may give written notice to the buyer that another offer has been accepted. So let's say we get buyer and seller come to terms, and there's an accepted offer on this property, but the offer does include this bump clause. So what this is saying is the seller can accept a bona fide secondary offer, and if they choose to, they may give written notice to this primary buyer, the one that has the current accepted offer, that another offer has been accepted. If the buyer does not deliver this to the seller, the documentation listed below, which is down here, within 24 to 48 hours, or 72, this is the range, 24 to 72 hours. After the buyer's actual receipt of the said notice, this offer shall be null and void. The documentation that the seller is looking for can be delivered, and they can do any one of the following. So it's got to be written waiver of the closing of buyer's property contingency if line 328 is marked. So if this offer includes the home close contingency, and the buyer wants to move forward with this offer, the primary buyer, then they've got to give this written waiver of the closing of buyer's property contingency. Again, if this is marked. 2, they could give a written waiver of, and this could include things like the inspection contingency, the financing contingency, etc. I will say it's not very common that other contingencies are included in a bump clause. But I'm going to give examples in a minute here of where you might want to use a bump clause elsewhere. Or number 3, they can deliver any of the following checked below: proof of a bridge loan financing, or a proof of the ability to close from a financial institution or a third party in control of the buyer's funds, aka a proof of funds letter, which shall provide seller with reasonable written verification that the buyer has, at the time of verification, sufficient funds to close, or other. So there could be additional earnest money involved. So a bump clause is not very common, but they are commonly used in conjunction with home close contingencies. So this closing of the buyer's property contingency, which I'm also referring to as a home close contingency. A lot of times a bump clause is also included to help protect the seller. So it's very advantageous for a buyer to have a home close contingency in their offer to purchase. In order for that seller to feel comfortable with accepting an offer with a home close contingency, they might want to include a bump clause. This gives the seller a little bit of peace of mind too, because it's very risky to accept an offer with a home close contingency because, as we kind of described above, this may or may not close. And if the seller is off the market, entertaining losing showings, for example, that again is not going to be a good deal for that seller. So they might want to include this bump clause. So let's say we've got now an offer to purchase with a home close contingency, and the seller says, okay, that's fine, but I want to include this bump clause. Then we'll say the seller will give the buyer 48 hours to lift that bump clause if they were to receive a bump notice. So by having this bump clause in now, the seller is going to be able to continue marketing the property. They're going to be able to keep it active within the MLS. They're going to be able to continue showing the property and communicate to other agents out there, yes, we've got an accepted offer, but there is a bump clause. So what we're hearing as buyer's agents is we are encouraged to write this secondary offer because the buyer number 1 may be bumped. So if that seller does accept another secondary offer, then that seller is going to go to the buyer and they're going to give them notice that there has been an offer accepted. Now the buyer has the 48 hours, or again, the default is 72 if you leave that blank. The buyer now has 48 hours to come to the table, come to the seller and say, okay, I'm going to waive my home closing contingency. I'm going to waive that closing of the buyer's property contingency, and I'm going to provide you evidence that I can do that by providing you a proof of a bridge loan or the ability, another way, a proof of funds letter, or maybe another pre-approval letter from a lender saying that I can in fact move forward on closing without closing on this property. The seller wants to see this in order to give them peace of mind that, okay, yes, you are waiving this home close contingency, but I really want proof that you can do that. So if that buyer has the ability to waive that home close contingency and not get quote unquote bumped from the offer, then we're going to waive this home closing contingency. The bump clause is now enacted and gone, and now both parties are moving to closing. On the flip side, if that seller accepts a secondary offer and the buyer cannot, pull their funds together, they cannot get a bridge loan financing, and they learn that within this 48 hours, then they're going to send a notice back to that seller and say, we can't do it. So then the offer becomes null and void. And then that buyer number 2 the one that the seller accepted the secondary offer on, is going to be moved into primary position. So you can see how, it's kind of a win-win for both in the sense that, okay, Mr. Seller, I know it's risky for you to accept this home close contingency, but let's make it more palatable for you by including this bump clause. An example of a bump clause being used without a home close contingency, you can include a bump clause in your offered purchases, and it may not be tied to the home close contingency. It's very rare that that would happen. I've definitely seen it in kind of just like oddball scenarios. I think the most recent one I can think of, there was a house that was it needed just a ton of work. It needed everything under the sun. And it was sitting on the market for a long time. There was no buyers. It wasn't priced low enough for the seller to sell it to an investor or something. And a buyer came along and said, okay, we do want to write on this offer. We would be interested, but we only want to do it if we can keep under our budget for what we think it would take to get this house back into the shape that we want it. So they wanted to write an offer and include a contingency that said, we've got 2 weeks to gather estimates. And if all of those estimates come under a certain number, come within our budget, then we are comfortable moving forward. The seller, though, was like, that's fine, but I don't want to keep my listing off the market. I want to continue marketing it and potentially accept a secondary offer and continue showings, because it's really risky for me to keep my keep my listing off the market for 2 whole weeks while you gather estimates, So they ended up including a bump clause. The buyer then was able to take their time to gather estimates. And the seller had a little bit more peace of mind knowing that they could accept a secondary offer, which a seller can accept a secondary offer at any time. And I'll go into that in a minute here. But they knew they had peace of mind knowing they could market their property, keep it active within MLS, and continue showing the property. And let me kind of clarify when I say keep it active within MLS. If there is an accepted offer with a bump clause, that is the one scenario where MLS will allow you to keep the property active in MLS, meaning you do not have to flag it active with offer, have that little, yellow C for contingent out there, and still promote it and allow for showings to happen. 9 times out of 10, when there is a home listed in MLS that has an accepted offer, most buyers are not tending not to see the property or schedule showings on that. So that's why it's nice for a seller to have that bump clause. Okay, any questions so far? Oh, yes, I've got a hand raised. I didn't see that. Tao?
Yes, so first, what is a bridge loan?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What is a bridge loan? A
Oh,
bridge loan?
a bridge loan is a product that lenders can use, which essentially allows the lender to take the equity from the buyer's current home and bridge the gap between the sale of that primary residence and the mortgage that they are about to take on. So it's kind of like a double payment at once of like their old residence, like their current residence, and the payment that it would be on their new residence. So it is, a heftier payment for a short period of time until that primary residence gets an accepted offer. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
So my question is, because the home sale contingency would technically fall under financing contingency, so can they just use financing instead of?
No. So that's how do I want to word this? So that is if you supplied a pre-approval letter that showed that the home needed to that they needed the funds from their current residents out, that seller is going to would want to use the home close contingency. It wouldn't be, I don't know if ethical is the right word I want to use, but it's not acting in good faith to provide a pre-approval letter, let's say, that didn't include the fact that they needed to get the funds from their home, and then they went, they got down the line and they didn't close on their one home, and then got out because of the financing contingency. So we do have to piece them out. Hopefully that was clear. But it does not fall under the financing contingency. It cannot be a condition on a pre-approval letter that they have to sell their current home, without including that home close contingency.
Okay. So then for someone who submit a secondary offer, the buyer number two would have to wait until the home that by one house got sold before they know whether or not they actually get the first one.
That's a good question. So no, so that is how that secondary buyer does not have to wait to see if this one closes or not, because once that seller accepts a secondary offer and then goes to the primary buyer, they're literally sending them a notice and saying, okay, we accepted another offer. We want you to either lift your home close contingency, let us know whether or not you can lift this or not, and provide us with evidence that you can within this 48-hour period. So that buyer who submitted that secondary offer, they're going to know within that 48-hour to 72-hour period whether or not they're going to be moved into primary position. So if you, as a secondary buyer, when you go into it, you'll know if there's a bump clause. And again, as a buyer who is writing a secondary offer, it might be more enticing for you to submit a secondary offer, knowing again that there's a bump clause and knowing that maybe there's a chance that you could be moved into primary position. So you don't have to wait until this close date. You only have to wait until this bump notice is done. So that 48 hours, 72 hours. Sometimes this is as little as 24 hours. So does that answer the question?
Yes. So in order for the secondary offer to become a primary, we just have to make an amendment or we have to remake the whole offer.
You would, so the buyer and the seller would negotiate their secondary offer. Again, still while there's a primary offer in place, and then they're gonna come to their own terms, and the buyer is gonna, be in that secondary position, and they're just gonna hang out again for this 24-hour period or 48-hour period. And then they're gonna learn whether or not they're gonna be moved into primary position or not. And then if they're not, then they're just gonna move on.
So
I had,
what hap sorry, go ahead.
no, I just had another hand raised over here, so I was gonna see what that question was.
Yes. So if the seller of so we have to use a home sale contingency, right?
Yep.
What if they get an accepted offer on the house that they're selling? Do we still have to use that home sale contingency in the offer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Because something could happen to the buyer something could happen
Yeah.
to the buyer of the buyer's property.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I just was hoping to get around it somehow.
I'm gonna revisit that notion in a second, probably at the end here, because there are ways to protect, like additional ways to protect both buyer and seller when there's an accepted offer on this primary residence, because it does, and it can get dicey, and leave the buyer in a very vulnerable position if there's an accepted offer on their home and then they were to get bumped, right?
Right, right.
Yeah, so, and I'll show you a way around that, in a minute.
Okay.
So, yeah. Tao, did you have more questions? I can also, now I'm gonna get into the secondary offer language, and maybe that will clear up some questions.
And just curious, like, so if the buyer one couldn't sell their house, and what happened to the owner's money that they will pay?
If buyer one couldn't sell their house, then they would, it would be expected that they would get their earnest money back. Yes, because that's why it's a contingency too, because they're saying to the seller, like, I'm being upfront about this. We cannot do this, so please accept this offer with this home close contingency. And then if they don't close on it, that is a legitimate means for exiting the offer, and seller should feel comfortable about getting rid of their earnest money, or like, sorry, seller should feel comfortable about giving their earnest money back. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Okay, so the secondary offer now, and I'm gonna say this, so the secondary offer can be made on a home with an accepted offer, and that accepted offer on the first home, or on the home, does not necessarily have to have a bump clause. So you might be in a situation where you would want to write a secondary offer for a buyer, and the chances of them moving into primary position are low. But let's say you have a buyer who found their dream home, and there's happens to be an accepted offer on it, and maybe they're willing to write a secondary offer and just see and hang out in secondary position, even though the chances are pretty slim that they would be moved into primary position, that option is still there. So I just kind of wanted to start with that secondary offers are not just reserved for listings that have a bump clause on it. It's just that it's more likely that a secondary offer is going to be written because there's a bump clause on that primary offer on the first one. Does that make sense? Okay, so how the secondary offer reads. So the secondary offer, you're gonna check mark line 348 if this is a secondary offer. This offer is secondary to a prior accepted offer. This offer shall become primary upon delivery of written notice to the buyer that this offer is primary. So if the offer falls apart with buyer A, and the seller wants to now move on to buyer B, they're just gonna do that with a notice to the offer to purchase, and it's simply gonna say, this offer is now in primary position. So unless otherwise provided, the seller is not obligated to give the buyer notice prior to any deadline, nor, and this is kind of a key phrase here, nor is any particular secondary buyer given the right to be made primary ahead of other secondary buyers. So what's that saying is a seller has the option, they can accept as many secondary offers as they want. So they've got their number one offer, that's the one that they have accepted with a primary buyer, that buyer's in primary position. And if they want, they can collect one other secondary offer, they can collect two, they can collect five, they can sky's the limit. And if that offer with their first buyer falls apart, they now have a pool of secondary offers that they could choose from if they wanted to. So just know that if there's a hot property and there are other secondary offers on it, it doesn't necessarily mean that because you have an accepted secondary offer that that buyer is going to be moved into primary position. So we need to make sure that we're communicating that with buyers. Like if you learn that there's another secondary offer, they may or may not be put into primary. So,
So
buy,
I got a quick question.
yes,
So if you are with a buyer and you're writing offers for the buyer, you can only do one at a time, correct? You can't like do multiple offers on different properties or
right. So you wouldn't want to do that in case
that they get accepted, right?
they both get accepted, then they're under contract under two different sellers. Yes.
Okay, so if you did write this secondary offer for the buyer, you would have to wait this 3 days before writing another offer, correct?
Yes. Good question. And
Thank
that's
you.
gonna, yeah, that's gonna lead me into this section or these next lines wonderfully. So, yeah, so, okay, so, where am I? Buyer may declare, so I'm at the highlighted line right now. Line 351. Buyer may declare this offer null and void by delivering written notice of withdrawal to the seller prior to the delivery of the seller's notice that this offer is primary. Buyer may not deliver notice of withdrawal earlier than, and you get to identify. I put in 3 here for this example. It defaults to 7. But you could put 1 here. You could put 10. But what the buyer is communicating to the seller, let's say it's 3 days. Okay, I'm gonna hang out in secondary position for at least 3 days. I cannot withdraw my secondary offer prior to this 3 days. But once that 3 days is up, then that buyer, if they chose to, they can still hang out in secondary position. But now they've opened up the right to withdraw it at any time after this mark.
And how do you withdraw an offer to purchase?
Also with a notice.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's the WB 41 or WB 42, excuse me. And no, I think it's the 41, WB 41, and it's just a notice and it says buyer hereby withdraws from secondary position. So just a quick 1 line. And so you can kind of see it's really it's advantageous for a buyer to have this count really low. It's more advantageous for a seller to have this days count to be pretty high, right? Because that means they've got a secondary buyer locked and loaded for at least 7 days. A lot can happen in 7 days. So kind of think about that from the listing agent perspective and how you would want to negotiate this number. But so for example, on one of my listings back in April, it had multiple offers. My seller accepted one offer, obviously, and the other offer that they were closest with, we went back to that buyer and said, if you want, you can hang out in secondary position until you find, another home that you want to go right on. So we countered back and said, why don't you hang out in secondary position for 1 day? And, you can't withdraw your offer for 1 day, but now you're just hanging out. And if something happens to this buyer number 1, we can come back to you. They didn't go for it. But that's kind of a nice way to like also give some insurance for your seller. And it's no harm, no foul to sit in secondary position. And if, another home came along that they wanted to write on, that buyer could quickly withdraw and say, okay, we're out of secondary position because we want to move on to this other property. So I've had it negotiated where this has been like 10 days because a seller accepted an offer with a inspection contingency. And the seller is saying, okay, we'll accept a secondary offer, but we want to see if they're going to hang out at least while we negotiate this inspection contingency. And if we don't get through inspection, then we'll move on to the secondary buyer. If we do get through inspection, then we'll just move forward, So, So those are ways too, again, and this isn't tied to a bump clause. But this is just, due to low inventory that a lot of times sellers are accepting secondary offers just because buyers want a chance at them because they are kind of running out of ideas. So, this last line within this provision is all other offer deadlines that run from acceptance shall run from the time this offer becomes primary. So that's also key to note that, once a secondary offer is accepted, nothing really happens until it's moved into primary. And that's when the deadline for earnest money comes in. That's when the deadline for the inspection contingency is calculated. Same with the financing contingency and the appraisal contingency. So there really is no like commitment from the buyer in the sense that they don't have to submit that earnest money, for example, until they are put into the primary position. So kind of tying it back to, the home close contingency and the bump clause, again, kind of going back to what I stated before about the likelihood of you writing a secondary offer is going to be higher in the case where that listing has a bump clause. So I'm coming along and I am writing on behalf of my buyer who wants to write on a property that has an accepted offer, but there's a bump clause. So they're fine with that. They're going to see. We'll wait out the 24 hours or 48-hour notice and we'll see if we can get moved into primary. So we're going to come along. We're going to communicate to that listing agent. We're going to write an offer. We're going to submit a secondary offer. The negotiations when you're negotiating a secondary offer does not change. You're going to negotiate the offer as you would normally. A listing agent might say to a buyer's agent, it's not worth it for us to accept a price that's not going to it's got to be a price that's probably going to match what, or at least and higher than what is their primary offer, just to kind of give you guys a line of sight to that. So buyer and seller still have to come to terms. Then the only thing that's going to be different is they're going to mark an X here indicating that it's a secondary offer. Okay, we've got that all set up. Now that listing agent is going to go back to their other offer, the one with the home close contingency and the bump clause, and they're going to say, okay, we've got an accepted offer now with a secondary buyer. Per the terms of our offer, you've got 24 hours to lift your home close contingency, or we're going to bump you and we're going to move on to the secondary buyer. The one thing that a listing agent now might negotiate for that secondary offer, they might want to make sure that this deadline here, this 24 hours, is matched down here. So that secondary offer, let's say this read 30 or 72 hours, and the first buyer had 72 hours to lift their home close contingency. We're going to want to make sure in that secondary offer that this is at least 3 days to put our sellers in the best position possible, because if this was lower, then it could be the case where a buyer number 2 were to withdraw prior to buyer number 1 saying that they can't do, that they're not able to meet and they're not able to close. So let's say buyer number 1, I cannot close on my home close contingency, and they did that, within their 72-hour period, but buyer number 2, their secondary offer was only negotiated for 2 days. There's a 1-day window in there where the seller could have no buyers if this guy withdrew after 2 days and this guy didn't let them know that they were going to not be able to move forward on that 3rd day. Does that make sense? So we have to make sure as listing agents that we're giving enough time. So if I've got a primary offer with a 72-hour bump clause, I'm going to make sure that this reads at least 4 or 5. just so that like I'm locked in with somebody at all times. Okay. What time is it here? I've lost my,
Sorry, I got up suddenly. I was nauseous for a second.
oh
Didn't mean to
gosh,
run off on you.
I hope everything's okay.
I'm
Um,
okay.
okay, so now I'm just gonna open it up for questions. Are you guys still kind of all following?
Yeah, I got a question. So is
Yeah.
this bump clause only for if there's a buyer's property contingency?
No. So that's kind of what I was saying before with that example of the property that they just wanted to gather estimates and make sure that they were coming under budget. So a bump clause can be put in place. It's just really rare. But if you've got a kind of an oddball, if a buyer has kind of an oddball contingency where I wish I could think of the other example I had. It just, a buyer might have a really weird scenario where, you know, they don't beyond like the traditional terms, like beyond an inspection contingency or a financing contingency, maybe they want their parents to see the house and the parents can't get there for a whole week. So, they're telling the seller, hey, we have financing. We don't have to write a home close contingency. That's not our issue. Our issue is that we've got parents who want to see this house and we want to make sure that they give us the green light. And so we want to write in there that we have a contingency of our parents seeing it. And they're not going to be able to get here for 7 days. So the seller might say, okay, that's fine, but I don't want to keep my home off the market for 7 whole days while your parents get here. So let's put in a bump clause because then I can accept another offer if I want to, So these are kind of really stretched, these are off the wall examples, but that's kind of where it's just like a weird term and the seller might be like, okay, that's fine, but why don't I put in a bump clause here then? Does that make sense? 9 times out of 10, a bump clause is only going to be tied to this home close contingency. And that leads me to another comment that, I can't move that leads me to another comment that, as a buyer, you don't want this bump clause in. So let's say, and I've done this before where I've written an offer with a home close contingency, but as the buyer's agent, I did not include the bump clause. We were far enough along on within the accepted offer of their primary residence. I think we were past inspection contingency. And I was like, let's just see if the seller will accept it, Maybe they'll accept the home close contingency without the bump clause. And they didn't, but kind of back now to, I don't know who was asking about this before, but that extra protective language when there's an accepted offer on the buyer's primary residence and the buyer does not feel comfortable about including a bump clause because then they could be bumped. They've got an accepted offer on their own home. So now they're in a sense homeless because they don't have a plan B because they don't have, they couldn't lift their home close contingency and there's an accepted offer. So I'm gonna go to my, I'm gonna try and find it here. Let me find it. Okay, so and this I've got like at the ready to send to people when they're in this predicament. Oh my God, my computer is just freezing up. Okay. So how this reads, and I'm looking right now in the bold. So upon acceptance of the offer at the buyer's primary residence, lines 335 to 347 shall be removed. Lines 335 to 347 is the bump clause language. Should any accepted offers on the primary residence fall apart, then the bump clause shall be reinstated. So you're just essentially, once there is an accepted offer on the buyer's primary residence, then you're removing the ability for the seller to bump them. And then to give the seller peace of mind, if that offer on the buyer's primary residence were to fall apart, then Mr. Seller will put the bump clause back in so that you're protected again. So I have found a lot of success with that because it is risky. So buyers and sellers have been prone to accept that and come to that agreement. So let me get back to the bump clause language. Maybe. Okay. So that's really all I have for now. I would love to open it up to questions if you guys have any. I think I just want the key takeaways here are, like the nuts and bolts of this, like, you'll come to Joan or I, or, Andy, or Dawn or Lisa at the Southwest office, if you've got specific questions on the contract itself, but just like as new agents, I just want you guys to hear like, okay, if there's a home close contingency, there's probably going to be a bump clause included. And then if we're going to be writing a secondary offer on a listing, the chances of that listing having a bump clause are pretty high. So, when a buyer is coming to you and saying, oh, can we still write an offer? You can say, we can write a secondary offer if you want, but the chances of it moving into a primary position are pretty low unless, and I'll find this out from the listing agent, if there's a bump clause on their first offer. So it kind of just like want you to have the tools to be able to communicate with your clients on it too. Any other questions?
So the listing agent is allowed to disclose that there's a bump clause or not, right?
That is the one term, yes, that they are able to disclose. Good question. So a listing agent can say, yes, there is a bump clause. They cannot even say whether or not it's a 72-hour bump or a 48-hour bump. Technically, they're not. But they'll be able to guide you and they'll just counter it back, in a secondary offer. Like they'll guide you on how long that's got to be. So, any other questions? Okay, so next week we're going to be doing the addendum AC, so that's the GMAR addendum AC. I was on track to do it for this week, but we're going to be talking about part of it in tomorrow's team meeting, so we're punting it to next week. But that's again the expanded provisions on the inspection contingency, the appraisal contingency, and then the escalation clause. So, and that's all in one separate form that you can use, but this is for competitive offer writing. Okay, so same time, same spot. Thanks, guys.